Chapter 29. The trail wound and twisted and seemed to double back on itself. There were side trails and forks in the path as well, and Will began to wonder if the dog really knew what she was doing, or if she was just wandering at random. There seemed to be so many choices, so many different ways they could go. Then, as he realized how focused she was on her task, he knew she was definitely following something. The question remained, though, what was it? He realized that Xander could be right. They could well be hurrying through the wood in pursuit of a badger or some other animal. Skilled as he was in woodcraft, it wasn't long before Will was totally disoriented, and he knew that he would be hard-pressed to retrace their path if he had to. He realized that Ormond's life was now well and truly in the care of the dog, and, from the worried glances that Xander kept darting at him, he knew the secretary was aware of the fact as well. They didn't speak. There was no point in voicing their fears, and the looming nature of the dark wood discouraged idle conversation. It was as if Grimsdell itself had a presence, a character. Dark, depressing, and threatening, it weighed down on them, alleviated only by the occasional clearing and the chance view of the sky overhead. They had been travelling for over an hour, Will estimated, when they came to a three-way fork in the trail. For the first time since they had started out, the dog hesitated. She cast down the right-hand fork for a few meters, then stopped, nose down, forepaw raised uncertainly. Then she snuffled her way back and tried the left fork. "Oh, God," Xander said quietly, "she's lost the scent." Then he looked fearfully at his master, lolling in the saddle, eyes closed, head sagging, held in place only by a rope they had lashed to his hands and tied to the saddle pommel. If they were to be left blundering through the wood, without any sense of direction or purpose, Xander knew it would spell the end for Ormond. The dog glanced at him as if in reproach, then uttered a short bark and started down the left fork, all traces of uncertainty now gone. Will and the secretary urged their horses forward to follow. They had gone 50 meters, winding and twisting, and perhaps making only 20 meters of progress, when Will heard Xander let out a gasp. He looked up. His attention had been fixed on the dog, he realized, and saw what had caused the cry of alarm. There was a skull set on a pole to one side of the trail ahead of them. A rough, lichen-covered board below it carried an indecipherable message written in ancient runes. The words might be indecipherable, but the message was clear. "It's a warning," Xander said. Will slid an arrow from his quiver and laid it on the bowstring. "Then consider yourself warned," he said dryly. "Personally, if I'm planning to ambush someone, the last thing I ever do is let them know in advance." He leaned forward to study the skull more closely. It was yellowed with age, and it was not quite human. The lower jaw seemed to thrust forward more than a man's, and there were fang-like canine teeth either side. The dog was waiting impatiently, and he signalled her forward. She started down the trail again, and suddenly she broke into a run, dashing forward and round the next bend, out of sight. At Will's signal, Tug broke into a canter to follow the dog, and they rounded the bend after her, and found themselves in a large clearing, with a substantial one-story building constructed from dark wood and thatched with straw on the far side. He heard the other two horses come clattering after him, then they slid to a stop beside him. "Looks like we're here," Will said quietly. Xander looked around the clearing, searching for some sign of human habitation. "But where's Malcolm?" he said. Then they saw movement in the trees on the far side of the clearing, and, as if the sorcerer's name had summoned them, figures began to step out of the surrounding woods. There must have been more than 30 of them, and even as he had the thought, Will realized that there was something unusual about them. They were... He searched for the right term and hesitated. He was not totally sure of what he was seeing. Even in the clearing, the light was dim and uncertain, and the people, if they were people, were staying close to the dark mass of the forest behind them, where the shadows were thick and heavy. He heard Xander's quick intake of breath, then the secretary spoke softly. "Look at them," he said. "Are they human?" Then Will realized what it was that had caused him to hesitate. They were human, he thought, but it was as if they were all dreadful caricatures of normal people. They were terribly misshapen, all of them. Some were dwarf-like, barely 4 feet tall. Others were tall and painfully thin. One at least was huge. He must have been 2.5 meters tall and massive across the chest and shoulders. His skin was a pallid white, and, aside from a few random wisps of yellowish hair, he was bald. Others were hunched over, their bodies twisted and bowed. There were several who were hunchbacks, their movements awkward and painful as they shuffled forward. Will's throat went dry as he realized that, among the 30-plus people facing him, there was not one who could be described as normally shaped. Obviously, this was the result of Malcolm's black sorcery, he thought. And as he thought it, he also realized that they had made a mistake bringing the unconscious Orman here. A wizard who could create such painful disfigurement among people was hardly going to help the castle lord recover from the poison that was destroying him. After their first movement out of the shadow of the trees, the creatures stopped, as if in response to some silent command. Will glanced down as the dog sank slowly to her haunches in front of him. He could feel the low, continuous rumble of warning in Tug's chest. It was an impasse, he realized. There was no sign of the wizard, unless he happened to be one of the misshapen creatures that faced him across the clearing, and somehow he doubted that. Malcolm, from all he had heard and seen of him so far, was more likely to be the creator of these things than one of them himself. "Ranger!" Xander's voice was low and edged with fear. Will glanced at him, and the little man nodded to the far side of the clearing. Following his glance, Will felt his own throat constrict with fear. The pallid-skinned giant had begun to advance across the clearing towards them, one ponderous step at a time. As he advanced, there was a low, wordless mutter of encouragement from his companions. Will slowly raised the bow, an arrow still nocked and ready, from where it had rested across his pommel. "That's far enough," he said quietly. The giant was nearly halfway towards them. He took another pace. Now he was in the very middle of the clearing, and Will realized he could not let him get any closer. Those massive hands could tear him, Xander, and Orman limb from limb, and probably their horses as well, he realized. "Stop!" he said, a little louder, with more of an edge in his voice. The giant met his gaze. Even though Will was seated astride Tug, their eyes were on the same level. The giant frowned, and Will saw his muscles tense as he prepared to take another pace. He slid the arrow back to full draw, instinctively sighting on the giant's chest, right where the heart should lie. "Big as you are, this arrow will go right through you at this range," he said, deliberately keeping his voice calm. The creature hesitated. He saw the frown deepen on its face. Puzzlement, anger, fear, frustration, he wasn't sure. The grotesque features were so bizarre, it was difficult to read them with any accuracy. The important thing was, the giant had stopped advancing on them. From the silent watchers at the edge of the clearing, he heard a collective sigh. Urging him forward, advising him to stop, again, Will had no idea. What next, he thought. Do we sit here until the next snowfall, facing each other across this clearing? He had no idea what to do. On his own, he would have trusted Tug to get him clear of the situation, but he couldn't desert Xander and Orman. "Ranger, look!" said Xander in a breathless whisper. He glanced away from the giant, who had, understandably, been occupying all his attention. Xander was gesturing towards the dog. She had risen from her crouched position in front of them and was advancing across the clearing towards the giant. Will caught his breath to call her, then stopped and released the tension on his bow as he noticed something. Her heavy tail was wagging slowly from side to side as she went. The giant looked down at her as she reached him, stopping just in front of him. Her head was lowered, and her tail was still wagging. The frown disappeared from the huge creature's face, and he went down on one knee, one massive hand out to the dog. She moved forward again to sit at his feet, and he fondled her ears and scratched under her chin. Her eyes half closed in pleasure, and she turned her head slightly to lick his hand. And then Xander drew Will's attention to yet another remarkable detail in a wholly remarkable day. "He's crying," he said softly. And sure enough, there were tears coursing down the pale white cheeks. "You know, I think he's quite harmless. Thank God you didn't shoot him." "I must say I agree," said a voice from behind them. "Now, would you mind telling me what the devil you're doing in my woods?"